So hello, my name is Liliana Fonseca and I am a research assistant at the EPRC. And in normal circumstances, these seminars would take place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And we look forward to doing that again in the future, but nonetheless, because of the constraints at the moment, we are delighted still to be able to welcome you from all over the world in this webinar today, and hopefully for future webinars as well. We have a presentation today by EPRC's very own Dr. Martin Ferry on the 20-minute neighborhood, a concept for the COVID era. And that's probably going to be one of the many questions that he's going to pose us today. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will also be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We would like to encourage you also to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar and just to share it. I'm sure you're all familiar by now with the protocol for Zoom meetings. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to remind you that we appreciate if you keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. Also, you can use the blue hand function to the raise hand function if you'd like to make an intervention. You can also feel free to use the chat function to send questions or comments even throughout the meeting, and we'll get to them eventually. Especially since after the presentation, we will have a Q&A. Let me present to you for now our speaker today. Dr. Martin Ferry is a senior research fellow at the EPRC. He specializes in regional economic development and urban policy, including a focus on Central and Eastern Europe and the United Kingdom. He has undertaken research on the implementation of national regional policy, cohesion policy, and urban policy, involving EU-wide evaluations and studies carried out on behalf of the European Commission, and comparative research projects conducted at the behest of national authorities or as a part of the EPRC consortia projects. Martin, I thus give the floor to you if you would like to start your presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Liliana. If we can hear me and see the presentation, if this is okay, then yes, thanks. First, hello everyone. I'd like to make the point that my presentation today isn't based on a specific research project or dedicated work that we've done. Rather, the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood and other similar initiatives is something that has cropped up in different forms in our work, looking at the urban dimension of regional policy, notably looking at EU-funded sustainable urban development strategies. Sustainable urban mobility is a key priority in many of them, and we've seen evolving initiatives that reflect some characteristics from the 20-minute neighbourhood idea. And these same characteristics have become prominent in discussions of regional and urban policy responses to the COVID pandemic. So my aim here is to raise some issues for discussion, things that should be considered when thinking about the evolution and application of this concept. I'll divide my presentation into these 4 sections. So looking first at the overall context, how the 20-minute neighbourhood idea fits into current regional policy thinking, particularly in terms of the urban dimension. I'll then look at some of the concepts, principles, organising characteristics. I'll flesh it out a little bit more by looking briefly at some examples in practice, and then I'll finish by raising some issues to be considered when looking forward, inevitably including in the COVID-19 context. So first, in terms of the regional policy context, I think it's become clear that this idea, the 20-minute neighbourhood and related ideas, pick up a number of strands in the current regional policy thinking, particularly in terms of how the urban dimension is addressed. First, there's the rise to prominence of the place-based initiatives in the regional policy debate. As with many fashionable terms, this can mean different things to different people. But generally, I think we can say it takes quite a fine-grained territorial focus, looking within regional and local administrative boundaries to identify the specific potentials and challenges of local communities and trying to design tailored initiatives to address these. So this includes different urban spaces and their communities. Second, of course, there's the regional policy push to support green and climate-friendly objectives. This again includes an urban dimension, responding to the sense of overconcentration of the population in certain urban areas, how this leads to undesirable side effects, congestion, pollution, urban sprawl. So cities are home to many communities, both spatial and social, and infrastructure that are vulnerable to the effects of global warming. Third, there's also the importance of well-being and resilience on current regional policy agendas. Comparable indicators of quality of life and well-being are increasingly used to look beyond the functioning of regional and local economies. So looking at a range of living conditions, physical health, welfare, risk of poverty, access to housing, services, and so on. The challenge of achieving sustainable urban mobility picks up on these issues. So the traditional approach of increasing mobility by providing more road space is not seen anymore as economically productive, environmentally sustainable, or particularly equitable. Urban areas experience traffic congestion, air pollution, high cost of transport, poor quality of life. So the cost of travel can increase considerably, especially for the less affluent. Access to services or public space can be limited for some citizens. Lower rents, land prices in extended city peripheries can increase travel distances, so limiting non-motorised forms of transport, and so on. In response, regions and cities have started to introduce measures to support urban mobility systems that are less detrimental to the health and well-being of people and work to benefit local economies and environments. So this overall is where connections are made with the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. Okay, so the 20-minute neighbourhood, similar initiatives, picks up and connects these prominent issues in regional policy at the moment. This is based on research into how city inhabitants' use of time can be reorganised to improve both living conditions and the environment. I've started this section with a quote from Professor Carlos Moreno, who's seen as one of the fathers, one of the leading figures of this concept, a scientific director at the Sorbonne and an advisor to the Mayor of Paris. As you can see from the quote, his key objective is to break down different types of social, economic, and architectural segmentation in urban areas. Basically, daily necessities should be within 15 or 20 minutes reach on foot or by bike. So work, home, shops, entertainment, education, healthcare, and so on should be available within the same time it may take a commuter to wait for a train on a railway platform. In terms of the basic principles, I think we can identify these points. Residents of every neighbourhood should have access to goods and services. Every neighbourhood should have a variety of housing types, different sizes, levels of affordability. Residents should have access to clean air and access to green spaces in their neighbourhood. People should be able to work close to home or remotely, thanks to the presence of smaller scale offices, retail and hospitality, co-working spaces or hubs. Within this, the concept is quite flexible. Indeed, it goes under different names in different contexts. So we have the 20-minute neighbourhood, the 15-minute city, and so on. I'll refer in a moment to some examples from European countries, but there are variations of this concept that have gained traction across the world, Asia, South America, and elsewhere. But some core components can be identified, and they're included in this slide. First, it means strengthened walking and cycling infrastructure. So giving more space to pedestrians and cyclists, making it safe, accessible, and connected. Also means giving access to quality public transport that connects people to jobs and higher order services. It also involves creating complex neighbourhoods, so decentralising core services, developing a social and functional mix in these neighbourhoods, including mixed housing provision. It also includes the flexible use of buildings and public space for multiple functions. And there's a focus on high quality public areas and open spaces. There's also emphasis on strengthening teleworking and service digitalisation, so the provision of Wi-Fi and high-speed internet, in part to support neighbourhood co-working spaces and hubs. In terms of planning, responding to this agenda has been associated with an increased focus on accessibility rather than mobility. So put simply, mobility looks at speed of travel. It's about how far you can go in a given amount of time. Accessibility, on the other hand, is how much you can get to in that time. So this means considering how many and what types of destinations can be reached within a time budget from a given neighbourhood. And then looking through scenarios for different modes of transport, different networks in terms of fit within this 20-minute or 15-minute rule. So priority within this is given to walkability and sustainability. I think this obviously implies a proactive rather than a reactive approach to spatial planning and regulation. So deciding ex ante where and where not development should take place. But these analyses ultimately inform policy decisions. Accessibility measures offer a clearer sense of what people value in cities, but the acceptable parameters of what's considered to be accessible must be set through policy. So developing consensus in this is obviously a challenge. There's a need to bring together different policy fields, transport, housing, economic development, social welfare, and so on. And it's also important to bring together economic development strategies and spatial planning frameworks, something we know from our research isn't always well coordinated. It's also important to seek participatory input from people and firms in neighbourhoods and across the city to map out the presence and absence at the neighbourhood level of these amenities, businesses, job types, public spaces, and so on. There's also an increasing emphasis on participatory budgeting or other methods to boost this participation, to give inhabitants a direct say on how investment is carried out in their neighbourhoods. The overall aim is to get active engagement from local inhabitants to inform the design of investments and commitment. I think it's also worth noting that a common component in these initiatives, 20 and so on, is strong local leadership. The launch of these initiatives is often associated with active involvement and leadership from mayors and other local actors, championing change and driving this agenda forward. Okay, I'll turn now quickly to some examples of the concept in practice. First, I'll take the case of Barcelona, which since 2016 has been implementing the so-called superblocks model. This was developed to provide a solution to the high levels of air pollution, the lack of public green spaces in Barcelona. As set out in this slide, the superblocks are groups of streets covering 9 blocks where traffic is reduced as far as possible to zero or close to zero, and with the space that was formerly occupied by cars given over to pedestrians and play areas. So this modifies road networks within 400 by 400 metre blocks to improve the availability of quality public space for community activities, for pedestrians and cyclists. As of last year, 6 superblocks were in operation. The reporting on it suggests that after some early pushback, the change has been broadly welcomed by residents, and analyses are suggesting long-term benefits in terms of health, pollution levels, and neighbourhood business development. In Paris, the importance of local leadership and a political champion has been quite important in their 15-minute model. This so-called hyper proximity and 15-minute city were a key pillar of the mayor's successful 2020 re-election campaign. The approach is designed to cut air pollution and to cut hours lost to commuting, and also to help the city achieve its plan to be carbon neutral by 2050. So Paris has already invested heavily in pedestrian and cycleways, and it aims to turn the city into numerous 15-minute neighbourhoods. The Mayor's committed to installing a cycle path on every street and bridge, enabled in part by turning 70% of car parking spaces to other uses. She's also about to increase office space, expand the use of infrastructure and buildings outside of standard hours, to encourage people to use local shops, and to create small parks, for instance, in school playgrounds that would be open to local people outside of school hours to make up for the lack of public space in some neighbourhoods. So closer to home here in Scotland, there's an example of the Glasgow Avenues project. This is part of Glasgow's city region deal, which is funding that combines investment from UK, national and city levels. Glasgow's investing approximately £115 million within the city to deliver on it. The basic aim is to introduce streetscape improvements throughout the city centre to form an integrated network of continuous pedestrian and cycle priority routes. City streets, as part of this, were assessed to establish where investment would create the greatest return, meaning socially and environmentally, as well as economically. Some pilot improvements are initially being undertaken on streets. Sucky Hall Street is one. These are acting as a sort of proof of concept for the overall plan. Specific improvements include free Wi-Fi and intelligent street lighting, avenues of trees, segregated cycle lanes, and increased pedestrian and cycle space that's connected, so continuous footways and paths. Okay, you can see that there are different forms of this basic model being rolled out in different countries and different contexts. It's important to think about the future prospects, particularly in the case of COVID-19, as I think the pandemic raises several important points that highlight both the promise and potential challenges. As you can see in this slide, I've included another quote. It's from the Glasgow Herald newspaper from September last year, and it's a positive reaction from Scotland's Climate Emergency Response Group to Scotland's programme for government for 2020-21. The programme includes a commitment to take forward the government's ambitions for 20-minute neighbourhoods. And this quote essentially looks at lockdown and sees that this has underlined the merit of Scottish Government's commitment to this idea. So I think there is an argument that the pandemic is providing momentum to the 20-minute concept. First, it's clearly increased focus on the well-being of communities and individuals. The priorities of resilience, sustainability, and livability are all being emphasised. There's also, of course, been a significant switch to remote working and the use of digital services to avoid commuting. People are spending more time in their neighbourhoods. The importance of an efficient, uncongested transport system has also been highlighted, not just in terms of limiting transmission of the virus, but also in increasing accessibility to care services. Of course, walking and cycling have emerged as more important forms of mobility for exercise, health and well-being. There's also been more use of smaller neighbourhood shops, a shift in the short term at least, from heavy dependence on centralised supermarkets and so on. There's been a rethinking of the nighttime economy as part of a decentralisation towards more neighbourhood focused patterns and approaches. But I also think that the 20-minute neighbourhood, the 15-minute city and similar initiatives, I mean, they're by no means without their critics. And I think looking forward, some tricky questions can be raised. The first one is, how does the 20-minute neighbourhood layer onto different urban forms and settings? There's a great deal of variation in terms of the scale, population density, urban shape and form, development patterns, institutional frameworks. These vary across cities and spaces. Several large cities in the developing world are heavily congested with uncontrolled development, weak regulatory frameworks, just to take this as an example. So replicating what's been done in Paris, in Barcelona, or in cities in the Netherlands may prove to be very difficult in some places and would certainly require much more physical and cultural transformations. Also, I think if we look at the example of the city region as a functional space, it may not be ideally suited in terms of employment concentrations and movement times to this idea. In Glasgow city region, the city centre has been quite dominant in terms of employment numbers. So unless the changed patterns of commuting and working from home that COVID has prompted, unless this becomes entrenched, the city region based on 20-minute neighbourhoods may need substantial job increases, for instance, in towns like Motherwell, where I am just now, in the outskirts of Glasgow, in order for this model to work. So should the concept apply for all functions? It may apply well to destinations for shopping or for recreation, but is access to jobs more of a regional issue for many people rather than a local issue? It's also important to think of this model and ask whether it's a solution to or a recipe for segregation, either social, demographic, or other types. It's possible to envisage the concept working well in neighbourhoods where inhabitants have the type of jobs that may favour remote working, but other urban communities may find it more difficult to adapt. It may be that for affluent areas where, for example, consumer demand can support small shops, that the fit with the 20-minute concept is more seamless than in more deprived areas. So in these circumstances, could inequalities, social exclusions, could these be reproduced? Another issue relates to the changed perception of the city. There's still the belief that a major asset and attraction of city life is the scope for a wide range of people and ideas to mix daily in flexible ways, thus producing creativity and innovation and so on. Does the 15 or 20-minute model limit this dynamism? Does it undermine the scale, intensity, the connectivity that drives cities? My final question is more practical or pragmatic. Transformations like these require capital investment. With the impact of COVID, likely period of austerity and constraints on public investment budgets, will further investments in these transformations be possible, be feasible? And I've also talked about the important role given to policy governance involving active local leadership and civic participation. But what do you do when local capacities, local cultures are not in place for this? So just to finish by drawing together some of the broad points from our presentation. First, I'd say the aims of the 20-minute neighbourhood and similar models fit well with key elements of current regional policy thinking. In the COVID era, it has clear attractions. If people are working more from home, then infrastructure and service provision must take this into account. However, I'd argue that there are difficulties in applying an equitable way. And I also think there's a challenge in finding the capacity and different resources to support it and in ensuring stakeholders are engaged. I've included a last slide here with some of the sources I've looked at here. But that's it. Thank you very much. As I've said, sorry, excuse me a moment. As I've said, this was just a review and issues, highlighting issues for discussion. And I think it would benefit from any views or insights from people taking part, and I'd welcome any contributions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for all your insights and the questions you posed as well. It seems to have generated quite a lot of interest because we already have some people with their hands raised. I'll start by John. I think you raised your hand first. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much, Liliana. Is the sound okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. Martin, thanks. That was a great presentation, really informative and interesting. I think it's looking at it from a Scottish perspective. I think, you know, Scotland is potentially going to be a really interesting laboratory. You talked about the Glasgow approach, but the National Planning Framework for consultation has a position statement which starts with building 20-minute neighbourhoods, and this has also been picked up today in the launch of the Town Centre Action Plan review, which was launched with ministerial endorsement. And we have some examples from other countries, particularly the Netherlands, of where the destination or a destination could be. But I've got a question that picks up what you said, partly about Barcelona and other points in the talk, and at the end about buy-in. And this is how you manage a transition, because on the one hand, you've got it's critical that you get that it's inclusive and that you get buy-in. On the other hand, as with any disruptive policy initiative of this kind that is going to create quite major changes to the way people live, work, travel, and so on, that there'll be resistance. And we've seen in London in particular, but not just in London, that the introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods last year led to quite significant pushback and also abandonment of some, in some cases, of schemes that were introduced. And the war on cars terminology that's very popular in some media has got quite a significant pushback behind it. And so I'm interested in, and this may be also a question for some of our Dutch and other participants in the seminar. I'm quite interested in what lessons there are in terms of implementing sort of 20-minute neighbourhood policies, and particularly how transitions can be optimally managed. Thank you.
Okay. Should I respond? Will I respond to this, Liliana?
As you wish. We can also gather more questions if it's not too overwhelming for you. Maybe go ahead.
Well, just to respond quickly to John's point, I think that's a key thing, as I highlighted in the presentation. It's the importance of participation and buy-in, which to me means accessing the local level, accessing the people on the ground, both in terms of informing the policy decisions, the investments that are going to be made, and then also committing themselves to taking this up. I mentioned the example of participatory budgeting, which we know is something that's increasingly looked at across different countries as a means of getting this buy-in, getting this commitment. But again, yeah, I mean, I also think the capacity to do this, to be as engaged at local level, is something that also has to be built up, and potentially over time. I don't know if there are any other participants here who have views from their own experience.
Thank you, Martin. I don't know if you still want to say anything, John, but you still have a hand raised. But yeah, I'll just go to the next person. Sorry, I should have
taken that down.
No problem. I don't know about the order, but at least on my screen, it appears to be Thomas Baum. So you could go ahead and ask your question. And next we have Andreas.
Thank you, Liliana. Tom Baum from the Strathclyde Business School. Martin, thank you very much for the thoughts and observations, and they tie in very closely with work we're doing on a Horizon 2020 project with 11 partners across Europe, looking at the relationship between temporary mobilities and social exclusion in cities across Europe. And you talked about Barcelona specifically. I think you might have in passing have mentioned Amsterdam. And one of the challenges in those cities prior to the pandemic was the proliferation of temporary lets, Airbnb and similar. I just wondered if there was anything emerging about how the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood can be reconciled with the dominant presence of temporary lets, which dilute, if you like, the potential for, from some points of view, of genuine neighbourhoodness, if there's such a word, and the use of resources that suit the local community as opposed to the visitor community. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks very much, Thomas. I mean, as I've said, from our research, this idea of making permanent changes, making embedded changes in local communities is something that we've come up we've seen as a challenge to implementing this approach in the different contexts that we've looked at. How that's done in practice is something that I think is still emerging. It's something we have to look at, particularly when it comes to things like finding the right balance of housing provision, accommodation provision in these neighbourhoods to make them more sustainable in the longer term. So more and more we've seen, or I've seen from what I've been reading, this housing mix seems to be a key element. A balanced housing mix in the neighbourhood seems to be something that's prominent. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's an important point you've raised about making these changes much more permanent and much more rooted in the neighbourhoods themselves. Thank you.
Okay, Andreas, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. It was wonderful to hear a genuine Scottish accent.
Yes.
Sorry? You can't hear?
I can hear you now. I can hear you.
Yeah,
now.
Okay. I was saying, Martin, it was wonderful to hear a genuine Scottish accent. No, but that's not what my contribution, for whatever it's worth. Well, first of all, I live in the center of Delft, and this is a 20-minute neighborhood. I mean, it takes me 21, 22 minutes to walk to work, if I ever walk to work, I mean, which of course at present I don't know. But my association with the title of your presentation was a totally different one. And it relates to what I've seen on the continent of Europe. For instance, the Euro district, Strasbourg-Kortenau, was interrupted very severely when, without an announcement, the German government introduced border controls. At, I think it was at 7:30 in the morning, the police came and closed the bridge as of 9 o'clock. And I see this all the way around. Governments required to do something about COVID, introducing border controls where they can introduce border controls. And these are very often not functional, like closing a bridge over which I think there are 34,000 cars every day commute. And this has now led to an initiative, at least to think in terms of giving cross-border areas the right to introduce their own tailor-made border controls, assuming that border controls is an instrument for fighting infections. And I was just wondering, I mean, this was my initial association, whether the 20-minute neighborhood could also be used in some way to achieve this particular purpose, to control lockdowns. There's a totally different dimension, but anyhow, that's the one that I hit upon when I saw the title. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas. I mean, it's something that we've seen in recent research, not strictly linked to the 20-minute neighbourhood, but how functional borders can perhaps be used in the lockdown context. We've found it from work we've been doing for the European Parliament on municipal responses to COVID, where a Euro region on the Polish-German border was able to, in a bottom-up way, come up with an arrangement which meant that crossing between different parts of the city where a national border was basically drawn, was people commuting and people for healthcare were still able to do it. So it was able to circumvent a national border to create, if you like, a functional response the COVID to the COVID pandemic. So I think that's a really interesting point of view, where moving away from administrative borders to deal with, let's face it, a pandemic that doesn't recognise administrative borders makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really interesting that you raise the 20-minute neighbourhood in that context. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for everyone who's asked questions. Is there anyone else interested in doing so? I see Robert Rogerson. Yeah.
Thank you. Martin, I think it was an excellent review of what the 20-minute, 15-minute neighbourhood model looks like. And it resonates with some of the research we've been doing at the moment, which I think you picked up on there, which it asks fundamental questions about some of the urban forms that we're used to. We have an EPRC project, a global one, that's looking at the future of the city centre. And the whole notion of the 20-minute neighbourhood and the city centre do not go well together. Your Avenues project talks about a movement across the city effectively, but it doesn't actually really address the 20-minute model. But one of the things that has emerged from I think the research we're doing is the challenge to the underlying principles that you outlined for the 20-minute one, which is, yes, it's sustainability, yes, it's good for neighbourhood cohesion, and it's great for well-being and physical elements, but is it really resilient? And you know, urban systems have been developed and supported by policy over decades and centuries because they offer resilience built in there, because there are always alternatives. There are always other things you can do, other places you can go, and we can move things around. And I'm wondering just how you see the 20-minute neighbourhood and the way it's been played out across different European cities, actually addressing that question of resilience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key question, Robert. I mean, I think if we're talking about again, long-term sustainability and the ability to withstand shocks or pressures and so on, is there a danger that we create too much of a fragmented pattern by blocking up into these smaller functional spaces? Is this a threat in terms of overall resilience? I think this is another question that it is worth asking when we look at this model and its popularity in the current debate. Is there a danger of being too micro in terms of the scale that we're looking at? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. Again, it depends how these different nodes or different neighbourhoods are connected more broadly, but I do think it's a clear point. It kind of goes back to the point I was making about the overall vision of the city, where it's, if you like, it's more than the sum of its parts. It captures these dynamic elements and processes and connectivity on a daily basis on a broader scale. This is traditionally seen as one of the values. Is something lost in that sense, and also in terms of the resilience issue that you've mentioned. So yeah, thanks. That's a good point.
We have a few other participants. Sinku Yu, would you mind asking your question?
Yeah, it's not a question, it's just following Andrea's insight. I was wondering, this 20 minutes neighborhood might also generate exclusion, not instead of inclusion, because I take China as an example, because of course it's quite extreme example in the world. But during the pandemic, I found that in most of Chinese cities, there are so many small neighborhoods, like 20 minutes walk neighborhoods. It's quite a big neighborhood in Chinese scale. So I called it 20 minutes neighborhood, and it's all locked down. So you found the rich neighborhood and poor neighborhoods. They have no connection. So rich people, they live in the rich 20 minutes neighborhood, and poor people live in poor 20 minutes neighborhood. So in China, it's probably not maybe some other places it's not a good example to elaborate it's not a good example for 20 minutes neighborhood, probably. So what is your opinion about it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think you make a good point, and it's something that I raised as a potential issue, as a question, whether this is a recipe for segregation, whether inequalities could be reproduced through these uneven mobilities. I think even in the case of Glasgow City region, as I said, there are very different spaces there that where the 20-minute neighbourhood model would have different implications. I mean, living in Motherwell, I think is a very different situation here, as I do just on the outskirts of Glasgow, from living in different parts closer to the city. It would need, I think, significant sort of changes here, socially and economically, to make the 20-minute neighbourhood model viable in a place like Motherwell and other towns in the city region as well. So it clearly isn't something I think that can be just mapped on seamlessly across different parts of a territory. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. Thank you.
David Webster. Yes, you can go ahead.
Right, I haven't got the answer to the question I'm raising. People do have done commuting studies over a long time. In other words, the journey to work. And these studies, which have been conducted over quite a few decades, they show a very consistent trend towards longer commutes. Now, it seems to me quite important to try and understand what are the different reasons underlying that very consistent trend, because the economist in me, have to apologise for that, feels a bit cautious about interfering with such a long-standing trend. I mean, I would entirely accept that the cost of travel, particularly travel by private car, doesn't reflect the full social and environmental costs. So I'm all in favour of pushing up the cost of travel, but I'm a bit cautious about stopping people from having these longer commutes, because I can think of several quite valid reasons why people want them, of which the most important is that I think the character of jobs in the modern economy is constantly becoming more differentiated. In other words, Adam Smith's division of labour is something that is continuing as a long-term trend. People are becoming more and more specialised and have to go further to get high productivity jobs. So now I'm not aware that anybody has really fully analysed all the different factors in play, but I think that there needs to be an effort to try and understand what is the relative weight of these different factors before you start messing about with urban structure in the really fairly drastic way that we're seeing. There we are.
Thanks very much, David. I think that's a really interesting, useful contribution. I mean, it goes a little bit in line with what I was talking about in terms of mapping this sort of model where you have different job profiles in different areas, where home working is maybe more feasible for some inhabitants of a neighbourhood than for others, where long distance commutes may be a necessity. So again, is there a danger that you get some sort of segregation? Different neighbourhoods where, as I said, home working is more feasible or more amenable compared to others. So I think this whole idea of how it maps onto commuting patterns is important. And of course, what does this mean when hopefully we come out of COVID? What will these commuting patterns be compared to what was there before we went into it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Nigel Lindsay. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Martin, for the clarity of your presentation, which I really appreciated. My question is twofold, really. Firstly, about the way we present public expenditure. And I was interested in the figure you gave for the Glasgow Avenues project of £115 million. We get used in discussing public policy to talking in broad terms about large expenditure, but to a lot of council taxpayers in Glasgow, of course, £115 million is an enormous amount of money. And to see a sum as large as that, really building cycle lanes, traffic-free roads and avenues of trees will seem a little controversial, particularly to people that don't immediately benefit from that expenditure, don't live in that area. And indeed, looking at it, I wonder whether that kind of expenditure can be justified. I have no idea about the Barcelona scheme, but it looks as if it might be fairly expensive to implement as well for relatively small numbers of people. At the other extreme, we have places that are undeniably part of Glasgow, such as, say, Drumchapel, where very little expenditure is obviously being spent, and where perhaps a similar amount could produce very useful results. And I just wonder about how easy it is to sell this whole idea under those expenditure constraints.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Nigel. I think that's also an important point, and it's something that, I mean, thinking particularly about the example of the Glasgow City Region deal, which this Avenues project was a part of. I mean, we had a seminar, was it last year, on this at Strathclyde on the City Region deal, and this was one of the questions raised. The Avenues project is one of several projects that are part of the city deal. It's been funded in different parts of the city, but at the same time there was a question, and this kind of goes back to the point about local capacity, local leadership, and so on. There was a question about how balanced the distribution of projects were across the city region, and how this was decided. And as I remember, a response from one of the people involved was that there is an active effort to get other parts of the city region to develop plans and to develop strategies for investment, to make it more balanced outside of the city centre and outside of the more developed areas. So I think this is a test or a challenge that people are aware of, to make sure that this sort of investment, including under the neighbourhood model, has this, if you like, territorial equity. But part of that is about also building the capacity to develop strategic projects and plans across the territory, not just within the centre itself.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Dominic Stead, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Martin, for your presentation. It was a nice overview of some of the issues here. I was struck by one of the comments that David Webster was raising, because I had in the back of my head, as well as this kind of specialization and differentiation of employment that we have in cities and regions, you can equally say that we have a differentiation and specialization of different services and facilities within the city. So it might be valid to expect that within 20 minutes or less, we can access basic shopping facilities, basic education, medical, healthcare facilities. But surely we can't expect a university to be within 20 minutes reach of everyone, or a theatre, or some very specialized kind of things that cities or even regions have to offer just in as one building or one kind of service within that whole region. So I think maybe the question is, what kind of services and facilities do we include in this definition of the 20-minute city? And it's surely not all the services and facilities that that are available. And I'm reminded here of the Rogers report in 1999. So now I'm going back more than 20 years. But there was a really nice diagram in there which shows all the different services and facilities that you can expect within the neighborhood, the district, the city, the metropolitan region. And they all have different catchments. You know, so you start off at the very local with a creche or a green space or something like that, and you move to the kind of the much higher level of the university, the conference center, and things like that. And I think it's worth revisiting that, just to kind of get an impression of, you know, what kind of things can we really expect at the neighborhood level. Maybe you can even see the diagram here. This is it. I mean, it's kind of expressed in terms of distance, but I think more or less to the same extent, you could kind of equate this with times of access, you know, and you're starting at the micro and you're going to the macro.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Dominic. I think that's a really useful contribution and visual image to look at as well. No, that's great. No, I mean, I definitely take your point. There is maybe a need for a more like differentiated or nuanced look. You know, what functions, what services should be accessible at what different thresholds or along what different boundaries. So again, it takes us towards the normal complexity of any place-based approach, where you try to be flexible enough to capture different configurations in different spaces. But I think that's crucial, as you say. Thanks.
I remember that Wilbert had his hand raised earlier. Do you want to go ahead now?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm actually a colleague of Martin's, but yet so I know a bit of his work. Yet I'm still impressed by the width and the links and the policy and planning implications that you made in the presentation. So thank you for that. And listening also to at the moment that I put my hand up, we were early in the Q&A part. So listening to a few of the early contributions, I think, and also of course the seminar itself. I think it's quite important that it looks like that we're seeing a sort of repackaging of something that's not maybe so new and maybe more salient than just a new concept, like which is inclusive street access, slowing down cities, and improving safety, putting an end to the victims in a literal and figurative way of the current system in many places. And maybe one thing to pick up on, maybe if you have some additional comments, Martin, that would be great, was I think John's question on the sort of backlash, war on cars. And I don't think we even need to necessarily look at the Netherlands for this to provide examples of transitions, or also because the situation is so different. I think a recent sort of mapping exercise showed that most of the Netherlands can be already seen as a 15 or 20-minute neighborhood in its urban areas. But maybe a closer example to like the Scottish situation would be in London, where I think about 6 or 7 low traffic neighborhoods have been implemented in the last couple of years. And I think there was a recent evaluation study on this, showing sort of, real benefits. So increased active travel, increased economic benefits, reduction in crime even, and simply improved safety. So in terms of this potential backlash, I think what's very important in policy approaches to concepts like this is really showing the benefits. So they are there, and sort of, keeping, you're right that there's often a sort of loud minority of opponents that call it like a war on cars. But it's difficult to maintain that stance if you just present the benefits as they are. And I think, yeah, so they both socially and like in terms of urban space in the city, but also economically, that these investments, I think one participant also mentioned the cost of the Glasgow Avenues project. I think it was shown that each pound or euro invested kind of returns itself in nearly tenfold in the case of these London low traffic neighborhoods. Yeah, in that way, I hope to have picked out some of the issues mentioned, and maybe, yeah, Martin would be keen to hear a bit more also on your observations on the role of the 20-minute neighborhoods for sort of the wider connectivity of cities and their role as creative places in which lots of people meet and come together, which obviously will be influenced by repackaging the mobility function of a city.
Thanks, Wilbert. Yeah, no, I mean, I think this what you've said feeds into like a general point that we find from lots of the work that we do at EPRC, which is the importance of disseminating the results of evaluations and studies, and making sure that there's appropriate communication and publicity attached to these, so that there becomes an awareness of what works and a benefit of and the benefits of what works. This is something that I think applies not just to this example, but across lots of the policies and measures that we study. So I think that's really important, particularly in a quite divisive debate like the one we have here. So thanks.
I see that we're coming up on the hour, so I would recommend that anyone that has any further questions to send it to us by email or to Martin directly. And I would like to thank everyone. By the way, you might have seen in the chat that Dominic Stead has shared that wonderful graph that he shared earlier, so you might feel free to just download it. I think someone is asking for the full reference as well in the chat. And just want to thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone for your interest in today's webinar. Our next webinar will take place on Wednesday, February 17th, with Wolfgang Petzold from the European Committee of the Regions and Magda Sapala from the European Parliament. They will present on how the EU budget for the next period was negotiated and what it means for regions and cities. So please use the same contact email if you want to register for this webinar or for the future ones and to keep updated on future events. So I hope to see you again, and thank you everyone. Have a good day.